4 days after a stranger in a smoke mask pulled me out of a burning stairwell and vanished before I could even see his face, I signed off, without reading it closely, on a routine layoff list that let go of the entire night shift custodial staff at my company's headquarters, cost-cutting, a line item among 100 others, and I did not think about it again until the afternoon I stood in a nearly empty maintenance office, returning a final paycheck to an old man I did not recognize, and saw, on his wrist, a bracelet I would have known anywhere in the world, because I had watched my late husband wear an identical one, engraved with the same worn, careful hand, every single day of our marriage until the day he died. I had fired the man who saved my life, and I had done it without ever knowing his name. 4 days before I found out he had already saved someone I loved once before, more than 30 years earlier, in a burning car on a dark road, when neither of them had any idea who the other one would someday become to me. I want to tell you what that bracelet meant, and what it cost me to finally understand it. But before I do me one quick favor. If you've ever failed to see the person standing right in front of you, doing something extraordinary in complete silence, hit that subscribe button right now. This whole channel is built for the quiet ones, who never ask to be seen. Go on, I'll wait. Now let me back all the way up, because to understand how one bracelet connected a fire 30 years apart, you first have to understand a burning car on a country road, a grieving widow who never stopped searching, and an old man who had spent his whole life being exactly the kind of person nobody thinks to thank. My name is Walter Odum. I am 62 years old, and until 4 days ago, I worked the night shift as a custodian at Ashgrove Tower, cleaning offices belonging to people who never once looked at me long enough to learn my name, which suited me fine, because I have never much wanted to be seen. I am raising my granddaughter, Ruby, alone. She's 12. My own daughter, her mother, died 6 years ago. A hard, complicated death I am not going to lay out here, only to say that it left me, at 56, starting over as a father for the second time in my life, and that Ruby, sharp and watchful and quietly funny, is the entire reason I get out of bed some mornings when the rest of it feels like too much. I took the night shift job specifically because it let me be home for Ruby's mornings and afternoons, walk her to school, be there when she got back, sleep in the strange hours in between, the way a man learns to when raising a child alone forces him into a schedule nobody would choose freely. It does not pay much. I have never minded that as much as maybe I should have, because the work itself, quiet buildings, empty hallways, the particular satisfaction of leaving a place cleaner than you found it, has always suited something steady in me, the same steadiness, I suppose, that once made me stop my truck on a dark road without a second thought. That, right there, is most of the story. Everything else is just details. Now let me tell you about a night, 31 years ago, on a dark stretch of country road, because nothing that happened at Ashgrove Tower makes any sense without it. I was 31 years old, driving home late from a second job I no longer even remember the details of, when I came around a bend and saw a car folded halfway into a tree, already burning at the front, orange light licking up through the crumpled hood into the dark. There was a young man trapped behind the wheel, conscious, bleeding, pinned by the door frame, and I did not think about it, not really, not in any way I could describe to you as bravery. I just stopped my truck, and I went, and I pulled that door until something in my shoulder tore that I still feel on cold mornings, and I got him out, seconds, maybe, before that whole front end went up properly. I stayed with him until an ambulance came, keeping him talking, keeping him from going under, and then, when the paramedics took over, I got back in my truck and drove home, because I had a young daughter waiting on me and a job in the morning, and it never once occurred to me to leave my name. It felt, at the time, like the kind of thing you just did, not the kind of thing you collected credit for. I found out, years later, secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance who recognized the story when I mentioned it once in passing, that the young man had lived, had recovered, and had spent a considerable stretch of time afterward trying to track down the stranger who pulled him out, an effort that never succeeded, because I'd given no name, and the road was dark, and eyewitness accounts of your own rescuer, apparently, are a great deal blurrier than people assume. I heard, too, that he'd had something made, a bracelet engraved with the date of the accident and a short inscription, which he wore every day, the acquaintance said, as a kind of promise to himself that he'd find the man someday and finally say thank you properly. I never gave it much more thought after that. It felt like a story that belonged to someone else's life, a debt I hadn't actually wanted collected. I did not know, for 31 years, that young man's name. I did not know until 4 days ago that he had married, years later, a woman named Colette, and that Colette Ashgrove would, decades after her husband's death, come to run the very company where an old janitor named Walter Odum quietly emptied trash cans every night, never once suspecting that the widow signing his paychecks was carrying, somewhere in a jewelry box at home, the very bracelet her husband had made for a stranger he never found. Now let me tell you about the fire. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday night, an electrical fault in an outdated section of wiring on the 14th floor, the kind of thing building inspectors flag for years before anyone finds the budget to fix it. I was working alone that late, most of the tower empty, when the alarms went off, and I smelled smoke before I ever saw it, thick and chemical, coming from the direction of the executive floor, where I knew, because I knew everyone's habits even though none of them knew mine, that Colette Ashgrove often worked past midnight, alone, in her corner office, long after her staff had gone home. I did not think about that night the way I'd thought about the burning car 31 years before. I thought about it even less, if that's possible, because there wasn't time to think at all. I grabbed a mask from the emergency supply closet I'd restocked myself the week before, and I went up the stairwell against the flow of the evacuation, against every instinct that should have sent me down and out with everyone else, because I knew someone was still up there, and nobody else seemed to be going to check. I found Colette Ashgrove in a smoke-choked hallway outside her office, disoriented, coughing, the power already failing, one hand braced against the wall, like she was trying to remember which direction the stairs were, and I did not introduce myself, because there wasn't air enough to spare on introductions. I got an arm under her, and I got her moving, down 14 flights in smoke thick enough that neither of us could have described the other's face afterward with any real accuracy, past emergency lighting flickering in and out, both of us coughing too hard to speak more than a few words at a time, me telling her only to keep moving, keep her hand on the rail. We were almost there. The same steady, useless-sounding reassurances I imagine I must have given a bleeding stranger on a dark road 3 decades before. I got her out through a side exit just as the fire crews were arriving. And then, because the crowd was chaos and the paramedics needed room to work, and I have never in my life wanted to be the center of anyone's attention, I stepped back into the confusion and walked away before anyone thought to ask my name. I did not think I had done anything remarkable. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters to everything that came after. I had smelled smoke, and I had known someone was up there, and I had gone and gotten her, the same plain, unremarkable way I'd once gone and gotten a stranger out of a burning car, because it never once occurred to me, either time, that there was another option. 4 days later, I lost my job. Continued in the next part. The layoff had nothing to do with the fire, at least not directly. It was a cost-cutting measure that had been in motion for weeks before the fire ever happened. A decision to outsource the entire overnight custodial staff to a cheaper contracted service, a line item Colette Ashgrove had approved in a budget meeting, without, I'd learn later, ever reading the actual names on the list, because a CEO signs off on 100 such lists a year, and cannot be expected to personally know every person swept up in each one. I understood that, even at the time. I did not take it personally. I have spent a career being the kind of employee whose absence gets noticed only in the sense that the trash starts piling up, and I had long since made my peace with being that kind of invisible. I came in on my last scheduled day, 4 days after the fire, to collect a final paycheck and clear out a locker that held, mostly, a spare jacket and a photo of Ruby. The building's maintenance office was nearly empty by then, most of the overnight staff already gone the week before, and it was there, standing at a counter signing a final form, that Colette Ashgrove herself walked in. I found out afterward that she'd come down personally, unusual for someone in her position, because in the days since the fire, she had become quietly obsessed with identifying the person who'd pulled her out. A mystery man, in a mask that the fire department's own report could not fully account for. No name logged, no formal statement taken in the chaos, and she had begun, out of some mixture of gratitude and unfinished business, personally reviewing building access logs and security footage, trying to find him. She looked at me, an old man in a worn jacket signing his own termination paperwork, and I do not think, in that first moment, she recognized me as anyone in particular. It was my hands she noticed first, she told me later, the particular way I'd braced one against the counter, a gesture the security footage from the stairwell had apparently captured clearly enough for her to have started, unconsciously, looking for. "Were you working the night of the fire?" she asked me. I told her I was. "Did you see anyone in the stairwell on the 14th floor? A man in a mask helping someone down?" I want to tell you I had some clever answer ready, some humble deflection I'd rehearsed. I didn't. I am not a man who is good at lying, and 31 years of never taking credit for the thing I did on that dark road had not prepared me for a direct question asked straight to my face by the very person I'd carried down 14 flights of stairs. "That was me," I said. Colette Ashgrove went very still, and then, I think mostly out of the shock and relief of finally solving a mystery that had been eating at her for 4 days, she reached out and gripped my forearm, right where my jacket sleeve had ridden up, and that is when she saw it. The bracelet. I have worn that bracelet, on and off, for years, not because it was mine originally, but because it had been given to me, decades after that night on the country road, by a man I'd never expected to hear from again. The young man from the burning car, once he'd fully recovered, had spent years trying to track down his rescuer and never succeeded. And somewhere along the way, through channels I still don't entirely understand, my name had finally reached him. A full decade after the accident, through the very acquaintance who'd first told me about the bracelet's existence in the first place. He'd found me, eventually, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, and he had driven 3 hours to my door, unannounced, and stood on my porch and cried, actually cried, thanking me for a night I'd nearly forgotten the details of, and he had pressed that bracelet into my hand himself, the very one he'd worn all those years searching, engraved with the date of the accident and 3 words, "The debt remains." I had tried to refuse it at the time, the way I generally try to refuse anything that feels like a reward for simply doing the plain, obvious thing. He would not let me. He stood on that porch and told me, in a voice that kept breaking, that he had a wife now, a good life he would never have gotten to live at all if I hadn't stopped that night, that he had thought about me, a stranger whose face he'd barely seen through the smoke and the pain, more times over the years than he could count, wondering if I was even still alive, wondering if I had a family of my own who'd benefited, in some small invisible way, from a man who stopped for a stranger on a dark road. He told me wearing that bracelet all those years, searching had been a promise to find me, and that now the promise was fulfilled, and the bracelet belonged with the man who'd earned it, not the man who'd merely worn it while searching. I wore it sometimes, since, more as a private memory of a strange and moving afternoon than anything else. Not thinking, 31 years later, standing in a maintenance office collecting my final paycheck, about what it might mean to anyone else at all. Colette Ashgrove stared at that bracelet on my wrist, and her face went through something I will never forget. Disbelief, then recognition, then a grief so raw and sudden it looked like the fire had happened to her all over again in that instant. "That's my husband's bracelet," she said, barely above a whisper. "That's David's bracelet. He wore it every single day of our marriage. He told me the whole story. A stranger who pulled him out of a burning car when he was young, before he ever met me. A man he searched for and finally found, years later, and gave that bracelet to, as a thank you he'd carried around his own wrist until the day he could finally hand it over." She looked up at me, tears standing in her eyes. "David died 4 years ago. Heart attack, sudden, no warning at all. He used to tell that story to anyone who'd listen, about the stranger who saved his life on a dark road and never even gave his name. I always wondered about that man. I used to lie awake sometimes, wondering if he was even still alive." Her hand was shaking on my arm. "You're him. You're the man from the road. And you're also the man who pulled me out of that stairwell 4 days ago. And her voice cracked completely. "I just signed the form that fired you." I did not know what to say to that, standing in an empty maintenance office with a former CEO's whole world rearranging itself in front of me. So I told her the truth, plainly, the way I've told the truth about most things in my life. "I didn't do either one of those things for a reward, ma'am," I said. "Not your husband, 31 years ago, and not you, 4 nights back. I did them because somebody needed pulling out of somewhere dangerous, and I happened to be close enough to do the pulling. That's the whole of it. I'm not owed anything for either one." Colette Ashgrove looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice that had found its steel again underneath the tears, "You may not think you're owed anything, Mr. Odum, but I have spent 4 years missing a husband who spent years of his own life searching for you, and 4 days not knowing the name of the person who saved mine, and I am not going to stand here and let you walk out of this building twice invisible in 1 week. That is not happening. Not today. Now, here is the part of this story I most want you to hear, because it's the part that matters most." Colette reinstated my position immediately, of course, and formally, publicly apologized for a layoff decision made without proper review. A mistake she took full responsibility for, in front of her whole leadership team. But she wanted to do far more than simply give me my job back, and over the weeks that followed, she tried, more than once, in more than one form, to give me an amount of money that would have changed my life, and Ruby's completely. A reward, she called it, for 2 rescues 31 years apart. A debt she said she needed, personally, to finally settle. I turned it down. "I can't take that," I told her, sitting in her office, Ruby's school photo still in the same jacket pocket it had been in the day I nearly lost my job. Not because I don't need it, Ruby and I could use it plenty, but because the moment I take a fortune for pulling 2 people out of danger, it turns into a transaction, something I did for a payout, instead of something I did because it was simply the right thing in front of me both times. Your husband already gave me the thing that actually mattered. 31 years of him carrying a promise on his own wrist until he could hand it to me properly. That bracelet is worth more to me than any check. I'm not going to let money cheapen either one of those 2 nights. "Then what can I actually give you?" Colette asked. "There has to be something. I refuse to let this just end, with you walking away with nothing but a job back and a thank you." And I told her the truth, which had been sitting in me since the night of the fire. "There are people in this building right now," I said, "cleaning offices at 2 in the morning, fixing wiring, running the boilers, people nobody thinks to learn the names of until something goes wrong enough that they're needed for a minute and then forgotten again, the second the crisis passes. That's most of my working life, ma'am, and it's most of theirs too. If you want to actually settle a debt, don't settle it with me alone. Build something that makes sure the next quiet person, who does something extraordinary in the dark, doesn't get laid off 4 days later because nobody bothered to read the name on a list. And, I added, because I am, after all, still a grandfather raising a 12-year-old. If you want to do one thing just for me, help me put a little away for Ruby's education. Not a fortune, just enough that she knows, growing up, that doing the right thing quietly, without asking for credit, is still worth something in this world. Colette built exactly that, a formal recognition and protection policy for building staff, ensuring that any employee involved in an emergency response would be flagged and reviewed personally before any future layoff decision touched their position, along with an annual, genuinely funded scholarship in her late husband David's name for the children and grandchildren of maintenance and custodial staff across her company's properties. Ruby was the first recipient, and she likes to tell people now, with the particular solemn pride of a 12-year-old, that her grandfather has personally saved 2 people's entire families and only asked for a scholarship in return, which she considers, she says, an extremely reasonable trade. Colette comes down to the maintenance floor sometimes now, on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. No reason at all except that she says it reminds her of the version of her husband, who used to tell that story about the stranger on the dark road, and standing near the man who lived that story out twice, 31 years apart, is the closest she still gets to hearing David tell it himself. She brought Ruby a framed photograph, once, of David, smiling, wearing the bracelet, taken not long before he died, so that Ruby would have a face to put with the other half of the story her grandfather carries on his wrist. Ruby keeps it on her dresser, next to her own school photo. 2 people, she says, belong in the same small, strange, lucky family now, even though one of them she never got to meet. I still wear that bracelet most days, though now, sometimes, I take it off and let Ruby wear it for an afternoon, and I tell her the story, both halves of it, a burning car and a burning stairwell, 31 years apart, connected by 3 engraved words that turned out to be truer than anyone involved ever expected. There's a version of this where I take Colette's fortune and let it quietly become the whole story, a lucky old janitor who got rich for being in the right place twice. And there is no version of that where I get to watch Ruby wear her grandfather's bracelet around the house, telling anyone who'll listen about the 2 people he pulled out of the fire, 31 years apart, without a single dollar changing hands either time. I picked the true accounting over the payout. I'd pick it every single time. So let me leave you with this tonight. A man spent 31 years being exactly the kind of person nobody thinks to thank, quiet and unremarkable and easily overlooked, right up until a bracelet on his wrist connected 2 separate acts of quiet courage that neither he nor the people he saved ever expected to find their way back to each other. The debt was never actually forgotten. It was just waiting, patiently, the whole time, for someone to finally look closely enough to see it. So here is what I honestly want to know from you tonight. Is there someone quiet in your life, easy to overlook, doing something steady and unremarkable, and possibly extraordinary, that nobody has ever bothered to properly see? The night janitor, the quiet coworker, the person who shows up and does the hard, invisible work and never once asks to be thanked for it. Go look a little closer. You might be standing next to someone carrying a debt nobody's ever properly settled. Tell me about them down in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight yours is the one I most want to hear. And if this story reached you, if you believe, like I've come to believe, that the quietest people are so often carrying the biggest, most unnoticed courage, then do me one small favor before you go. Subscribe so the next story finds you too. Leave a like so somebody else remembers to look a little closer at the person nobody else is thanking tonight. and go thank the quiet one standing near you. I'll be right here, reading every word.